After the Second World War, international politics were dominated by the Cold War, a state of political tension between the Western powers, the United States and NATO, and the Eastern powers, the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. Polarization between the two blocs was accentuated in 1961–62 with the building of the Berlin Wall, which divided Berlin into the Eastern and Western blocs. The US pursued a policy of containment to fight communism any time and any place it occurred. Cold War anti-communism was not limited to foreign policy. The other side of the coin was domestic anti-communism. This was a time of irrational anti-communist witch hunts led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who tried to discover communists, bring them to trial and punish them. He had a list of people, mostly intellectuals or rival politicians, whom he accused of anti-American activities and communist sympathies, in consequence of which many lost their jobs or left the country. McCarthy was eventually asked to prove his accusations, and as he had no evidence, he was dismissed. American military intervention in Korea and Vietnam was part of the containment policy which sought to limit the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. At the end of the Second World War, Korea was divided into two zones of occupation: the Soviet-occupied North Korea and American-occupied South Korea. In 1948, both zones formed governments: the Republic of Korea in the south and the People's Democratic Republic of Korea in the north. Tensions between the rival nations exploded in 1950 when North Korean troops invaded South Korea. The United Nations immediately condemned this act of aggression, and American President Harry S. Truman, 1945–53, sent US troops to Korea to fight alongside members of other United Nations forces. After 4 months of fighting, in which the combined US-UN troops drove the North Koreans back, China entered the conflict alongside North Korea, and fortunes changed rapidly and completely. Bitter fighting continued, and the unpopularity of the war led to the election of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1953–61, who promised to bring the conflict to an end. The war finally ended in July 1953, having cost the lives of 54,000 American soldiers and leaving 103,000 wounded. North Korean, Chinese casualties were 10 times higher. The Vietnam War was a long conflict which set the communist regime in North Vietnam under its leader Ho Chi Minh, supported by the Soviet Union and China, against South Vietnam, supported by the United States. In 1955, American President Eisenhower promised military equipment and advisors to the anti-communist forces in South Vietnam. In 1961, the next president, John F. Kennedy, 1961–63, increased American aid to Vietnam. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, 1963–69, sent US troops to fight in Vietnam in March 1965. The numbers of American troops involved in the conflict grew. Within 2 years, there were 500,000 American soldiers engaged in war in Vietnam. Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, 1969–74, attempted to reduce the number of American ground troops in Vietnam while increasing American bomb attacks. Protest in America grew ever stronger. In November 1969, the biggest ever protest in America saw 250,000 people protesting peacefully in Washington, D.C. The Vietnam War split American public opinion. While some believed that the protest was unpatriotic, many, especially on America's university campuses, became increasingly bitter about American involvement. A large number of soldiers deserted, and as many as 500,000 young men became draft dodgers, fleeing to Canada to avoid being called up to serve in Vietnam. Further bomb raids on Vietnamese cities drew international criticism, and in January 1973, the US and North Vietnam signed a peace treaty ending American involvement in the war and leaving Vietnam under the control of the Communist forces. When the last American troops returned home in 1973, the war had cost the US over $160 billion and about 60,000 American lives. The number of Vietnamese victims is calculated as being between 1 and 3 million, counting both military and civilian personnel. In 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to North Vietnam, and the country was reunited as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in 1976.